Welcome, everybody, to Soccer 101. My name is Taylor Rockwell, and I am excited for this one and also slightly terrified. Because this week we are continuing to take a look at domestic soccer in the nations that have already qualified for the 2026 World Cup. We want to get a better feel for the leagues, players, and coaches we might not have much, or in today's case, any familiarity with ahead of next summer's tournament. We've already spent some time on Japan and the J League, or the J1 League, or the J.1. League. I forget what it was. This week it's another AFC country that finished top of its group. It's Iran. 6 of their 11 starters in their final qualifier against Uzbekistan play in the domestic league, and literally every player in the squad cut their teeth there as well. So what is the Persian Gulf Pro League? Why is it called that? How good is it? And what are the major obstacles it faces at present and in the future? Here with me today is a man who knows all about the Persian Gulf Pro League. He's watched it for years, ins and outs of teams, coaches, managers. It's Graham Ruthven. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Taylor Rockwell. Yes, you just can't stop me talking about Tractor FC on Weekend Review. Every single week we have to cut that section down. Yeah, I totally share your feeling, your sense ahead of this episode, which is excitement. I had a great time researching this episode. Also a bit nervous for this one, just because it's really not in our usual wheelhouse. And that's the first thing to say is when we do these episodes, I like to think that I have a base level of knowledge. Even when we did the J League, which is not a league that I watch every single week, I knew a little bit about the J League. Today that is not the case. I knew next to nothing about Iranian league football before researching this episode. We've watched the national team at World Cups, of course. Played the US in 2022, but very little about the domestic league. So if I get something wrong, I apologise. I'm doing my best. I hope the research we've both done for this episode can cast a light on a league that, at least in a Western sense, goes unnoticed most of the time. But this is not something that is on my radar on a daily or weekly or even monthly basis, to be honest.
I think that's very well said, Graham, because I'm in a similar boat of if you said name an Iranian club, I would have been like, no problem. And then if you had added except for Persepolis, I would have then had a problem. And so I think we are both coming at this from we want to learn more about football in the country, we want to learn more about the league, but we are not by any means experts, though we've both done a fair amount of research, and I'm really excited to talk about it. I would also say there is some trepidation whenever you are talking about a national team or a nation, in this case Iran, where there is politics and history inextricably linked to the teams, to soccer, to sport, to everything else. And a good example of that is that it is called the Persian Gulf Pro League instead of the Iran Premier League, which is what it was previously. Graham, did you look into why it is called this? Because that right there is an interesting story unto itself.
Yeah, a little bit. So you might have even more information than I do, but Persian Gulf, of course, is a body of water in the region. This has been a decades-long naming dispute around that body of water. If you look at a map, you'll see that the Gulf is surrounded by Qatar, Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, probably missing a couple of that as well, and Persia is linked to Iran, and so all these different countries have disputed that it should be called something else. That for a period when obviously the British were linked, it had a or in that sea, so to speak. They argued it should be the British Gulf, and so it's a whole thing that stretches far beyond soccer. And so my impression, Taylor, maybe this is where you have a bit more information than I, is just that it's like a form of chest beating to name the domestic league after the Persian Gulf. Do you have more information?
That is it exactly. Right. Yes. I also read the British Gulf thing and thought like, wow, there's no current examples of a country who's maybe not popular in the area trying to claim a body of water as their own. But yeah, it's been the Islamic Gulf, I think, on occasion. It's been the Arabian Gulf. It's been the Persian Gulf for a very long time, and including in many as like Islamic sources and Islamic scholars. But it is a source of debate, as you said, Graham. And so it sounds to me like it was we want to stress our importance in the region, stress that is what it should be called, and so we will name our league after that. And so you already have the kind of intertwining of politics and the sport right there.
And even domestically within Iran, you have a cultural and geopolitical landscape in the country itself where there are different regions with different identities. So you have separatist regions, you have East Azerbaijan that we're going to talk about, or at least one of the clubs that's in East Azerbaijan, that's Tractor FC. And so my read is they maybe feel Persian Gulf is a safer term to use rather than maybe the Iranian Premier League, which some people in other regions might not kind of feel any connection to.
So with all that said, we'll get to more of that later. Let's start with just the basics, Graham. Let's talk about the league itself. Let's do an abbreviated history, shall we?
Yes, let's do it. Go.
So I think we could start at 2001, or we could start in like the 1930s. And I think either one really works, because essentially football has existed in Iran for a very long time. I think the oldest club was founded in the 40s. I think the oldest like professional club. But even there, it gets kind of murky really quickly, because you have different regimes in different political eras, and then you have the instability with the Iranian Revolution leading into the Iran-Iraq War, which basically is completely disruptive to domestic soccer and to really all of domestic life in Iran and Iraq for a good decade or so. So you have disruptions in the leagues, but then you also don't really have professional play to the level that we understand or expect. And that is part of why you have this sort of rebrand in 2001, because there's an idea that from the Iranian FA that we need more professionalism, we need more standardization, we need more modernization if we want to continue to improve as a footballing country.
Yes, 2001 is a big turning point for Iranian football. As you say, Taylor, that's when they have a professional league. It's been called the Persian Gulf Pro League since 2014. Before that, it was the Persian Gulf Cup. By the way, these leagues have had multiple names over the decades. I'm not even going to mention all of them. Before 2001, for a long period, it was called the Azerbaijan League. That was the top division in Iran, and it was called that after Iranian prisoners of war, because that word Azerbaijan, which I've almost certainly not pronounced correctly, means liberated.
I think it's Azerbaijan. I think I could be wrong, but yeah.
Yeah, that sounds better than whatever I said. It means liberated in Persian. So even there, you have like geopolitical things enveloped into this league. So that was the top league between 1991 and 2001. Before that, you had something called the Local League, apparently, which was created in the 70s. A very amateur operation, as you say, Taylor. It is disrupted by war in the region in that time. But up until 2001, Iran didn't have a professional soccer setup, which, given the history of the sport in the country, it's the most popular sport. As you say, it goes back to the 30s. They've had a successful national team over a number of decades, relatively speaking. Was kind of surprising to me that they didn't have professionalism until as late as that.
Right. And then I think even when they did have professionalism, there is still an idea that though it is the most popular sport in the country, it is like largely contained in Tehran is where you're finding any level of success, the Iranian capital. That is where I think until the foundation of the new league in 2001, you don't have a single league winner outside of the capital. And so you can see there that like while you are meant to be using football to develop talents from around the country, it is largely isolated in one area where the majority of the fandom is, where the majority of the success lies. And there have been attempts, some of them organic, some of them less organic, to maybe spread some of that success around the country.
Yeah, and that leads into what I was saying about the name, why they didn't want to kind of rile anyone up in provincial areas of the country, because those were areas where they wanted growth. And I think there has been a lot of success in growing the soccer in these clubs in those areas. The team that is top of the table right now, Tractor, are from East Azerbaijan. So varying degrees of success with this league.
Yeah. And so you then, because you don't have like the kind of full professionalism as we understand it, you have a lot of state-owned teams. You have a lot of teams that are affiliated with government organizations, PAS, PAS Tehran, who do not exist anymore. And again, we're pronouncing it as best we can, so I apologize if people take issue with the way we say cities or areas or the like, but PAS Tehran was the club of the police. The majority of the funding came from the police, and so you have those connections. Tractor, as Graham has already mentioned, sponsored by the largest tractor manufacturer in the country. You have that with automobile manufacturers and electronics manufacturers. You have lots of connections to companies or state-owned companies or state-owned entities.
Yeah, and the two biggest clubs in Iran, you mentioned one of them earlier, and you pronounced it much better than I would have. Persepolis,
yeah.
Persepolis, and Esteghlal. Man, I'm really trying my best here. Those are the two biggest clubs in Iran, and until fairly recently, they were state-owned. They were owned by the regime in Iran until FIFA and the AFC collectively said that shouldn't be allowed. They're playing in the AFC Champions League every single year. They have since been sold to a consortium of Iranian banking companies who are owned by the regime. So I'm not entirely sure how much separatism there is there.
And since I imagine we will jump around a little bit to various topics as we go, that does seem to be feature of Iranian club football rather than a quirk is the idea that like teams move. And I mean that in terms of geographically, but also just you'll get new owners, you'll get rebrands, you'll get mergers, you'll get licenses acquired by new entities, which then change the name or keep the name but change the squad. And it does seem like it is a bit more apt to change soccer in Iran. But then you have the kind of institutional clubs that have won for decades and decades and decades that are going to remain largely the same, though with different sponsors and different kind of owners behind them. So you do have a lot of change that sometimes is representative of growth and then oftentimes is representative of turmoil.
Yeah, and those two clubs that I mentioned, Persepolis. I mean, first of all, it's maybe worth outlining what the format of this league actually
is. You sure?
is.
You don't think we should just go straight into the history of Iran? All right, fine, let's do it, yeah.
There's more time for that later. I'm sure that's your bag, Taylor. The current format, it's a 16-team league. They did expand it to 18 teams for a period about 15 years ago, quickly went back to 16. Season runs from July to May. Each team plays each other twice, home and away, nice and easy, 30 games in total. Team that finishes top, this is all standard stuff, but just worth outlining. Team that finishes top is champion. Runners-up and the winners of the cup competition go into the AFC Champions League. Bottom two teams are relegated. It's pretty standard format. And you have two dominant teams, Persepolis, those two teams that I mentioned. Historically, they've won more Iranian titles than any other team. They've won it 16 times. They've also won it in each of the last 2 seasons. Actually, they've won it 7 times in the last 8 seasons, so they really have been a dominant force. You also have that other team that I mentioned, Esteghlal, as one of the big traditional superpowers of Iranian football. They've won the title 9 times, their most recent time being 3 seasons ago, and they draw big attendances, those two clubs, which makes sense given that they're based in Tehran. The other one that draws big attendances, we've mentioned them already, Tractor. They're based in East Azerbaijan. They call themselves the Barcelona of Asia because they see similarities with Barca being a symbol of Catalan culture, and also it makes them sound really good if they call themselves the Barcelona of Asia. And East Azerbaijan has a similar independence movement, and Tractor are the club of the region. They get huge crowds. So just last weekend, they had over 120,000 fans for a game against Esteghlal. Huge game in the title race. Tractor are top of the table. They've never won the title before. They scored a stoppage time winner in that game to keep their place at the top of the table. I included it in a newsletter. It was incredible. Some of the videos from that game were sensational. So this is a league that has big clubs like CIES Football Observatory, the best observatory. They have Tractor and Persepolis as in the top 50 supported clubs in the world.
Really?
Yeah, so these are clubs with big fan bases. You look at the attendances, the average attendance across the league tends to be around 8 to 10,000. For context there, the Premier League's average attendance is 40,000, MLS is at 21,000, so still a level below that. But looking at some of the average attendances, Iran's kind of placed around the same area as China, Colombia, Greece. It's slightly ahead of Austria. It's ahead of Serie B in Italy, Norway. So that gives you an idea of what sort of interest we are talking about. These are clubs that get respectable crowds, certainly.
Yeah, one of the numbers I saw for Esteghlal was that in 1999 they set an attendance record with 121,000 supporters watching a game. Some well-attended teams. One other one to mention in there was Sepahan SC. They're based in Isfahan. They've won multiple championships. They haven't been as successful as some of the ones you mentioned, Graham, but I think they're the first one to win a league title that wasn't based in Tehran, the capital. So you do get more kind of like disparate entities more recently. And I feel like with that in mind, not just because they're top of the table, it does seem like Tractor are the most kind of exciting team in Iran at present. I mean, certainly helped by where they are in the league table, but I think like they have some of the younger players that have played in the national team recently. I think like that branding is probably working as being the Barcelona of Iran, but it does seem like they are a somewhat positive spot in domestic Iranian football.
Yeah, absolutely. I was reading that their youth academies had a bit of an investment recently as well. It's interesting you mentioned the branding. They've had a rebrand as well, so their badge looks much more kind of, I don't know how to describe it, modern or Western facing. Like it looks a bit like the Bristol City badge. You look at some of the other badges in the Persian Gulf Pro League and it kind of stands out. So yeah, in a country where there's not a lot that is outward facing, it feels like Tractor are potentially an exception to that.
Do you think they're going to win it all, Graham? Is that where your money is?
I hope so with that name. I mean,
Right?
it's great for the newsletter. People clicked on that at the weekend, so I might do a full in-depth newsletter on Tractor FC.
Will Graham own a Tractor FC shirt?
Oh, I'd love to.
I actually didn't look at their kit manufacturer. I'm assuming there are Iranian companies that do a lot of their production and design. But that would be an interesting one to keep an eye on, because it does seem like there is... It seems like it's a very Iranian-centric league, exemplified by certainly the players and a lot of the coaches, but also the sponsors, the owners, and the like. And I think it's worth noting there are also restrictions on foreign players, which is a positive and a negative. It has theoretically helped grow the game because you have more Iranian players playing in the league. At the same time, there's the argument that if you had more foreign players coming in, could you improve the quality? Could you improve the standard of play overall? But the cap as it exists is 6 foreign players, I think, allowed in a squad, but it's 5 unless one of them is from an AFC nation. So it's basically 6, but one has to be from an AFC country.
Yeah.
And you don't get as many sort of name imports at that. I think Steven Nzonzi, Abubakar Kamara, and Wissam Ben Yedder all play for the same club. And outside of them, there are not many foreign players whose names I recognized.
Yeah, they play for Sepahan, right? The club that you were talking about earlier, which was kind of surprising to me. I mean, it's worth noting that Wissam Ben Yedder has a rape charge in France, and so there's probably more to him making that move to Iran. I did actually know about that, him going to Iran. Slightly surprised to see Steven Nzonzi's. Yeah,
good to know, I guess. Yeah,
and maybe that is worth mentioning with Iran. You're talking about a country that has certainly outdated views when it comes to women, particularly with soccer, right? Because women have been banned from stadiums, or were banned for 40 years from entering stadiums, and you've had FIFA and the AFC applying pressure to ease some of those restrictions, and women have been allowed in to watch some World Cup qualifiers. But the allegation is that that was basically a show for the cameras, and so and that women still face a fight for basic human rights. So I feel like that's something that's worth mentioning with Iran in this league, because you look at those crowds and there's something that very clearly stands out to you.
And I am certainly not trying to be like, life was better back then, because I don't know enough to say one way or the other. I don't know what life was like under the Shah, other than that he was unpopular and overthrown. But there are images of Iran from prior to the revolution that remind me of the images of Afghanistan prior to the Taliban and the Soviet invasion and the Taliban takeover, where it is much more enlightened, looks much more Western. Not that that is the end-all, be-all of society, but that you had women's clubs in the 70s. Not professional, but you had many, many women playing football. That was then outlawed after the revolution, and so you do have the kind of repressive norms, quote-unquote, come into play, and so you don't have as much involvement, and there is still certainly a lasting legacy and impact in the present day as a result.
Yeah, it's a big factor with the league.
Yeah, and I guess since we're, singing the praises, we could talk about some other issues here, because I think a lot of the instability when it comes to names and ownership and even operations, with some clubs sort of ceasing to exist overnight, a lot of it relates to financial issues, and a lot of that relates to sanctions and international banking sanctions, so you can't spend as much, you can't conduct transfers as easily, it's tougher to get, solid reporting on financials, exemplified by, I was looking up who is the most expensive foreign signing in league history. And according to reports, it is $2.5 million spent by Persepolis to bring in Croatian striker Mario Budimir from Lokomotiva Zagreb in 2020. If you look up that signing on Transfermarkt and a few other sites, that's listed as a free transfer. Right. So did they spend money? Do they spend money? It does not tend to be a lot spent, and that's for clubs like Persepolis and Estelal, who have significantly higher budgets than other clubs in the country. So you're not getting a ton of expenditure when it comes to signings and transfers. You're getting a lot of local player, local development, which I think, again, is why there's been a focus on spreading football outside of just Tehran, where you kind of are all cannibalizing the same areas for the same players, basically.
Yeah, there's not a lot of transparency, and that just leads to the hint that these clubs and the league are not making a lot of money. I tried to dig into the TV revenue, which was very, very difficult to find anything on, but it seems to be an area where Iranian league football lags well behind, because as far as I can tell, there is a national TV deal with a channel called TV3, but they sometimes show a match every week, other times don't show a match. This is a state-owned, centralised TV station, so the deal is with a state broadcaster who apparently don't pay a lot for those rights because there's involvement from the ruling state in a lot of the clubs, and so this is an area where you compare it to some of the other leagues in the region, in Asian football, the K-League, the J-League, even the A-League, I guess, with Australia being part of the AFC, certainly the Saudi Pro League, some of the money that they're getting from not just domestic rights deals, but there's a DAZN European deal for the Saudi Pro League, and there's, as far as I can tell, there are no international rights for the Persian Gulf Pro League. So, this is something that is holding these clubs back. It's maybe a byproduct of the geopolitical landscape, and you have an isolationist country here that doesn't really want to face Western or outward in any sort of way, and in the current landscape, whose main ally is, maybe Russia as a superpower, and so there's a lot of things to contend with there, and it also speaks to a lack of just infrastructure and central guidance from the league, and everything that I've read says that governance has been a problem for the league for decades. Yep. I believe there's currently an acting head because of a scandal who replaced the past acting head, and that lack of leadership just makes things like TV deals and generating revenue and building an infrastructure and making the most of this genuine interest in these clubs. Like, this is the main sport in a country of 90 million people. And then you look at the infrastructure, just looking at the stadiums as well, and it's clear that there's some form of failing there, in my opinion anyway.
Yeah, and I think emphasizing the our opinion aspect of this part of the show, I will say, like, neither one of us reads or speaks Farsi, and so we are then reliant on either translations or English language kind of coverage of the league and of the country. And so there's always the concern about, are you getting like the regime's perspective? Are you getting biased foreign perspective? And you kind of have to kind of thread the needle. From my experience living next to Iran, I will say that, to your point about like the regionalism, there was definitely a feeling that certain areas were never going to get funding or never going to get a massive amount of support because there are either ethnic minorities there, like in the north where there's a very sizable Kurdish population. Again, thank you, the British, for just arbitrarily drawing lines on a map. And so I think where there's already maybe some separatist sentiment there, there's maybe less of an inclination to have a well-funded, super strong Kurdish-centric club in that area. So you don't really have strong Kurdish clubs. I think you have a few that play in like the lower divisions or play at amateur level or have historically played but don't exist anymore. And as you were talking about with Tractor, you get sort of similar regional separations and breakdowns. And so I think there's just many different factors at play in a country that is, it seems to me, pretty rabid for football and very passionate about it and very passionate about their clubs. And then certainly those players are passionate about the club that they represent, but also the national team. And that's where you get such strong performances on the international stage, relatively speaking. You're not having Iran win the World Cup, but you are having a team that is always difficult to beat, that is always going to make life difficult for opponents because the sport matters so much, and I think playing for the country and playing for their people matters so much.
Yeah, Iran's national team is always competitive. They've qualified for they've been at the last 3 World Cups. They've now qualified for a 4th. They'll be at 2026, which is kind of why we're doing this episode at this time. They've made the semi-finals in the last 2 Asian Cups. I think they would view that as an underperformance. Yep. They've previously won the Asian Cup, but not for decades and decades. I read one article that said they expect more of this team. And this
when
is
you say
kind
the
of
Asian Cup, is that the Asian Champions League or is that something else?
No, that's like the Euros. Like the Euros or the Gold Cup for Asian football. So they do well, like they make the latter rounds, but I think there's an expectation from fans that they should be winning that competition. They've won it in the past. And there's always this challenge. We faced it in 2022. I've faced it at previous World Cups as well. There's this challenge where Iran are going to be competitive. You're going to need to know things about Iran. I mean, the US played Iran at the last World Cup. We had to analyse that game. And yet, with a couple exceptions, I mean, Mahdi Zare is Iranian and obviously plays for Inter and played for Porto and good teams. Jahanbakhsh as well, who was at Brighton, is now, I think, at Heerenveen. Was it Feyenoord? He's a player that listeners will be familiar with as well.
Sardar Azmoun would be the other one, I think.
Yeah, there's a collection of recognisable names there. The domestic players, though, I know nothing about. But you know they're going to be a relatively high standard. You know they're going to be competitive. So that's always kind of it's clear there's a good pipeline from the league into the national team. I would argue that some of that is by accident, because when we covered the J League a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how there was an ethos that was adopted at the beginning of the 21st century, and how they'd invested in infrastructure and their academies and these partnerships. And I didn't really get that sense from the Persian Gulf Pro League. The infrastructure isn't at the same level. But as I said, you've got a soccer mad nation of 90 million people. The natural factors for Iran are good and are strong, and that is something that when you have a domestic league that has a cap on foreign players, that maybe doesn't attract foreign players, even accounting for that cap. I mean, there's a good number of Brazilians in there. That one of the all-time top scorers is a Brazilian who plays for Fulhad called Luciano Chimba. There's a good number of players from around Africa as well. Not many Europeans, but there's a good number of foreigners there. But it's largely a hostile environment for outsiders, right? I mean, as a Brit, I am advised not to travel to Iran. You hear cases of people who do travel, they get arrested at the border, they get detained. I presume it's similar for the US as well. So it's a hostile environment for outsiders, I think it's fair to say, and that doesn't then lend itself to outside investment. You also have, like, Saudi Arabia has obviously the PIF fund. Iran is also a resource-rich nation, but doesn't have that same investment program that Saudi Arabia or UAE or Bahrain even or Qatar has. So you have a number of factors that makes it very difficult for Iran's league. But the knock-on of that is lots of opportunities for domestic players, and that has strengthened the national team over decades.
It's weird, though, because it's like strengthened the national team in terms of you have a pipeline from the domestic league to that national team. You are always going to have players coming through. The national team itself is fairly old, I think. I think it's like 15 or 16 by my count of the players who are in the most recent squad are 28 years of age or older. I think only 3 were 22 or younger. And so you get players who are all, competing against each other, and you have some competitiveness within the league. But when you extend that to, say, the AFC Champions League, that's where I think you see the difference in class or in quality between some of the teams. Because you've had Champions League winners from Iran, but the most recent one was Estalal, I believe, in 1991. More recently, if you look at it from this season, I think Estalal was the only Iranian team in the knockout round. They were knocked out by Al Nassr from Saudi Arabia 3-0 on aggregate. That was the first knockout round. Sepahan the year before, knocked out in the first round by Al Hilal from Saudi Arabia. That was 6-2 on aggregate. Fulad, you mentioned them, were knocked out in 2022 by Al Hilal. 3 teams in the knockouts, all 2 of them knocked out in the first round in 2021. Only Persepolis made it to the next round, where they were knocked out by Al Hilal again. So you have Saudi dominance, Qatari dominance, UAE dominance from that part of the region, and then you have consistently Japanese clubs making it pretty far in that competition as well. So once you move outside of the Persian Gulf Pro League to the Asian Champions League, that's where I think you see the quality of the league fall down a little bit by comparison.
Yeah, I also looked at the AFC Champions League for that comparison, Taylor. I also looked at Opta's rankings, which, as with we spoke about this with the J League, I'm not entirely sure about their methodology, but I kind of, this one, my hunch is that what they have for the Persian Gulf Pro League is probably correct. So they certainly list it below the J League. They also have the K League, the Saudi Pro League, and the A League ahead of the Iranian league in Asia. So they rank it pretty much, it's like the 5th strongest league in Asia. They rank it pretty much level with the Iraqi league, slightly ahead of the Iraqi league.
I personally would definitely put it ahead of the Iraqi league, having a tiny bit of experience with the Iraqi league.
Okay, sure. Well, they have it ahead of the Iraqi league, but not by much. So my hunch says that this is possibly like around the top 30 mark in a global sense, like top 30 league, the Persian Gulf Pro League. But obviously, it's always difficult to compare leagues.
It is really. It's also just like the frustrating reality of the world, and especially the world we live in, that like we had an Iranian friend on in one of the very first episodes of the Total Soccer Show, back when there was the so-called Green Revolution, where there was kind of a move towards progressivism or relative progressivism and modernity. With I think the candidate then like was encouraging people to wear green as a show of support, and you had a few Iranian players like wear green armbands, and they were forcibly retired, asked to retire, not called up anymore, and so you got like the sort of the political involvement within the national team, but that was my first introduction to the idea that people like people. And I think on the whole, Iranians are some of the friendliest people in the world. They're some of the most welcoming people I've ever experienced in my life, especially Iranian Kurds. But that there's the kind of government interference and the way the government has operated globally. I'm talking about many different governments, but in this case, Iran's government. I think also then you see the ramifications when you look at the infrastructure or lack thereof when it comes to some of these clubs, where you aren't able to improve because you can't build modern stadiums if you don't have modern equipment and materials, but also if you don't have the resources or the excess resources to go about building a modern stadium. And so you have teams that I think have passionate fan bases that have talent and have kind of academies, or at least like strong histories and strong records of youth development. But when you don't have the infrastructure and the funding and the stability behind them, I think it gets really hard to move to that next level. So we'll see what happens with Iran in 2026 at the World Cup. I think we kind of have an idea of what we expect to see. I look forward to kind of learning more about them as that tournament comes closer. But I'm assuming it will be a hard-fought, hard-scrabbling team that will defend deep and then rely on some of those attackers we've already mentioned to try to make a difference for them.
Yeah, I mean that's 95% of international soccer, right?
Pretty much.
So they're doing it better than most. I certainly wish that Scotland had Iran's record of qualifying for World Cups
and beating the US in a World Cup. Iran did that in '98. But I think like when you then look at the teams more recently, it is oftentimes a domestic goalkeeper, a domestic backline. The central midfield, like from when it's more defensive, is domestic. And then when you look at the attacking players, anybody who's going to provide that creative spark, they tend to be playing in foreign leagues, broadly speaking. So I think that even can kind of show you where the talent development is in the Iranian league versus maybe where it could be if they had a bit more funding and a bit more support.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to know how much European clubs, I don't have an answer to this, I'm afraid I didn't include it in my research, but how much they are scouting Iranian football, like Mahdi Zare, obviously, as a top quality number 9. Like, I wish Scotland had Mahdi Zare leading the line. I'm sure the US would like Mahdi Zare as well. So I'd be interested to know how much kind of awareness there is from European clubs, and also how like difficult it is to start that pipeline into Iran to get the talent out.
Because I think you automatically, and again, speaking as a Westerner, like my assumption is that you automatically run up against the same preconceived notions that I might have and others might have, which is like, if I'm a British scout, can I go there? Can I scout players? Who do I have to deal with? Will the government allow me? Like, will I be perceived as a spy if I go in there? I think if you're an American, you almost certainly will. So I think that like, because there is that reputation of being hostile to foreigners, and a history, I guess, in certain ways, there is an idea that like maybe we'll go scout elsewhere in the area, and even like I think parts of Iraq are maybe seen as more stable and more kind of fruitful for looking for players at this point. So it's a very like turbulent situation that still has positives within it, because there are players coming through, there are teams that have been so successful and clubs that have been so strong for so long. You just also have instability and geographic issues and everything else that kind of folds together.
There's so many factors, and their floor as a soccer country is so high. As I say, soccer mad nation, 90 million people with a real history of soccer. There's just so many factors that holds them back, and you can see it in the league, right? Where in the early 2000s, when the league starts, you look at the attendances, it's up in like, the average attendance was up in like 15,000 for about 3-4 seasons straight. It felt like there was a real boom. You had clubs across the country, not just in Tehran, really investing in things. And since then, as far as I've read anyway, and I've kind of researched, everything's stalled. Yeah. And because you just can't, it's so difficult when you have all those factors against you to develop any further. So they are at that competitive level, but it's just difficult to envisage. As much as I have already said, like Iran are competitive World Cups, they qualify, never been out of a group stage. Like, they don't embarrass themselves, they're competitive, but they just can't make that next step. And that's where the geopolitical and economic things kind of come in.
To that stall that you're talking about, I think this is another really like interesting moment. So around 2007, that is a date that I would like to spotlight for a moment. And again, it depends on who you're reading and what your sources are. But like with some sources, there's an idea that there is an intentional move of we have too many clubs in Tehran. We need to spread out clubs that like maybe attendance isn't so great, but everybody's kind of looking in the same areas. There's way too much overlap, and we don't have the regions as well represented. And so there's a deliberate move, according to some sources, to move teams out of the capital and into other areas. And so you have clubs being moved. I mentioned them previously, but like PAS Pas Tehran are moved to a different area. They are reformed as Pas Hamadan, which is about 300 kilometers away from Tehran, that area. And they had won the league 5 times as recently as 2004. But they have flagging attendance, and there's this idea that there's just too many teams, so we're going to move them out. And on the surface, that seems like, oh yeah, that's a really logical thing. If you have too many teams that aren't getting the attendance, you move them to areas where they might. I mean, that's the whole idea of moving a franchise. You move them where they might, that you have that team then represent that local populace, that local region, and maybe you get more interest in the sport that way and more competitiveness and more success. But then you read other sources, which are on the ground and not government affiliated or league affiliated, which speak to kind of operational malfeasance and a lack of money and a lack of infrastructure and players like refusing to play for clubs and managers walking away. And there's just kind of this instability around that period that you're talking about, that it might be flagging attendance, it might just be a lack of enthusiasm, it might be poor soccer, it might be other factors, but it all leads to a feeling of like whenever there is progress, it kind of gets weighed down. And so we now are in a position where league is still going. There are strong teams. They are still making the knockout round of the Asian Champions League. The national team is still like a difficult team to beat, and you're always going to have to prepare for. But it doesn't feel like it's kind of moved on to a next level, whatever that next level might be.
Yeah, and you contrast that to some of the other leagues in the region, right, where you've got Saudi money, obviously.
Or are they spending money?
Ronaldo. Yeah,
I had no idea.
You might have heard that, yeah. But even like I did an article not so long ago about Bahrain and them maybe looking at Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and wanting to invest in their own soccer stuff. I think they're looking at like Premier League teams. I know they've bought an F1 team in McLaren, so they're kind of getting involved with that side of things as well. So with Iran, it just feels like they might be squeezed out further. Particularly when you look at the strength of the J League, which we covered a couple of weeks ago. The K League is competitive as well. The A League has recently had a rebrand and a lot of money come in and new clubs in New Zealand and so on. So, yeah, I don't know what the future holds for the Persian Gulf Pro League. It's a competitive league, but it's not one that I envisage becoming more apparent on our radar anytime soon, for better or worse.
I would agree with that, and I think it's hard to watch the games. It's hard to watch the teams. You could watch like Asian Champions League. That's probably the easiest way to watch Iranian teams, except that then they get knocked out, so you can't really watch them anymore. But I would say this as like a closing note for people who are new to soccer or getting into it or getting excited about the World Cup again. You have sort of, I guess, like different categories of teams that compete in international competitions, and you have the favorites, the teams that have won it before, you would expect to go deep. You have the dark horses who have assembled a golden generation or assembled talent or could be at that kind of level where they could kind of push on. You have bad teams, you have okay teams, and you have teams that like are sort of, I can't explain it other than like have heart and will pull in neutrals because you can see how much it means. I would look at like Georgia at the last Euros, where I think they were a team that certainly weren't playing the best football, had some very good, like talented players in there, but I think the intensity and spirit and pride of that national team makes them enjoyable. The raucous supporter base that goes with them helps with that, and I think Iran is a country like that. Morocco, I think, is maybe another example, though they play some pretty exceptional soccer at times as well. But I think Iran could be a nation that I think neutrals end up enjoying because there is that spirit and there is that intensity to their performances, which is clearly informed by being aware of they're representing their country, they're representing their people, they want to do them justice on the international level. I would just like them to be able to do them even more justice with even more success, with even more successful players playing in top leagues. Will that ever happen? I don't know, but it's an idealistic thing to hope for. I'll say that.
Yeah, there's always that prospect as well with a team that you know less about, that there's a star I mean, that was always the thing going back decades. That was the magic of the World Cup, was that you would watch teams you wouldn't normally watch and there'd be a star player. I think the Women's World Cup still retains that, maybe a little bit more than the Men's World Cup. Where
Barbara Banda, man.
Tournament. Yeah, Barbara Banda, or like Linda Caicedo was one that I remember from the last tournament, and I think she just joined Real Madrid. She's more of a genuine superstar now. But at the time, I hadn't really watched much of her, and she was just absolutely explosive in that tournament. So it maybe happens a bit more in the Women's World Cup, but Iran are ripe for, I mean, it didn't really happen in the last World Cup. I don't think they had a breakthrough star, but maybe there will be one in 2026, and that is what makes international soccer fun.
I think the gold standard remains Ali Daei. We mentioned him previously, not Ali Dia, but Ali Daei. He is probably the best known Iranian footballer of all time. Maybe Mehdi Taremi more recently has gained some ground just in terms of name recognition because he plays for a big club. But Ali Daei, with his 108 international goals, I believe that was the record for a good long while. I don't think it is anymore. But he's in the Asian Football Hall of Fame. He played for some big clubs in Germany and around the world. So I think he is probably the Iranian name that people might know. We shall see if somebody else rises to the occasion and surpasses him at this next World Cup. If they do, we will certainly be talking about it on the Total Soccer Show. For now, though, Graham, I think we've spent plenty of time, or as much time as we possibly can, discussing the Persian Gulf Pro League, to give it its proper billing. I am still very much enjoying this series of looking at domestic football in different countries, and I look forward to more countries qualifying so we can do the same in Oceania and Africa, certainly, and more Asian Confederation countries, maybe even Europe. I don't know. I feel like we don't spend a ton of time talking about certain domestic leagues in Europe, South America, CONCACAF. Lots more to be discussed, Graham Ruthven.
Yeah, I think we're going to make a little bit of a series of this, so people in the TSS Plus Discord should let us know what countries they want to do. They want us to do next. I think Argentina has qualified. That might be one that's ripe for one of these. The other thing people should let us know in the Discord, I mean this genuinely, anything that we have got wrong or a little bit more context that we should have about things. As I said at the top of the episode, this was an episode where I was starting from a standing start, which is, I think, for both of us a little bit rare. So that Discord would be good.
A slight peek behind the curtain, but also a sign of Graham Ruthven being good and game to do one-on-one episodes. Was my suggestion yesterday? Well, why don't we do another? We weren't sure what we were going to do. I was like, why don't we do another team that's qualified domestic league? I looked up who'd qualified, and I was like, oh, Iran is qualified. And Graham was just sort of like, okay, I don't know anything about them, but we'll see how it goes. You were up for it, but I think there was a level of I know nothing. We'll see how we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. And I think what happened is that Graham did some reading, I did some reading, and I came away with hopefully a more complete understanding of domestic football in Iran, but also with a sort of depressing reminder that politics tends to involve itself when it definitely doesn't need to.
Yeah, you can do the preview for Iran for the 2026 World Cup. You can start now.
I'll get hyped, man.
These notes. Yeah.
I'll get hyped. I'm going to go watch some Persepolis, some Estelal. Maybe I'll learn along the way how to actually pronounce some of these names. Again, it is not a Roman script. It's hard to know, even if the Roman spelling or the Roman alphabet spelling is even the correct spelling of the word before we even get into the pronunciation thereof. So, Graham Ruthven, thank you for attempting to pronounce things, to attempting to learn about football in a country that we don't know much about. I have enjoyed it. I hope you have as well.
Thank you, Taylor Rockwell. I now support Tractor FC. If they want to send me a shirt, I will gladly receive that.
I think Tractor's the way to go, Graham. I like that for you. I like that for our listeners. I certainly like that for Tractor FC. Thank you, listeners, for listening. We hope you enjoyed. If you did, tell your friends who might be interested in international soccer or the World Cup. Tell friends, family, even people who aren't your friends, but you still want them to know more about soccer. Let them know as well. We greatly appreciate you spreading the word, and we'll talk to you again next week.